The digital signature bloomed across the screen, a sterile blue vine finalizing a transaction of human collateral. From his silent, climate-controlled study overlooking the ochre dunes, Khalid al-Jamil watched the remote feed. On the screen, a portly American man with a sheen of sweat on his upper lip grinned, his relief disgustingly palpable. He was Mr. Croft, a man whose failing businesses had led him to sell the one asset he had left: his daughter. Beside him, a young woman sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were bone white. Annalise. Her name felt foreign and brittle on his tongue, a name he had only ever seen in faded reports compiled by his security team. She was 20, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes so wide and full of a quiet terror that Khalid felt an unwelcome pang of something that was almost guilt. He swiftly crushed it. Guilt was a luxury, and his life, for all its unimaginable wealth, was devoid of luxuries of the emotional sort. His world was one of polished marble, silent servants, and the quiet hum of the advanced motors in his wheelchair. It was a kingdom of profound isolation, and he was its paralyzed king. The deal was done. In exchange for erasing a debt that could swallow a small country, Annalise Croft was now his wife. Her father was already celebrating, a cheap bottle of champagne being uncorked just out of frame. But Annalise didn't move. She just stared at the pen on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Khalid watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw her flinch when her father clapped a hand on her shoulder. He saw the single silent tear trace a path down her cheek, a tiny, glittering rebellion in a face of frozen submission. He zoomed the camera in, his fingers moving deftly over the controls. He needed to see her eyes again. They were the color of a stormy sea, and in their depths he was searching for something. A flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory that was not hers to have. But there was nothing, only fear, cold, pure, and absolute. He cut the feed. The screen went black, reflecting his own impassive face, the white of his thobe a stark slash against the dark leather of his chair, the red and white of his keffiyeh perfectly draped. His attendant, Faisal, entered the room without a sound. "It is done, sir?" Faisal's voice was low, respectful. "It is done," Khalid confirmed, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Prepare for her arrival." The private jet landed like a whisper on the tarmac, its sleek silver body shimmering in the brutal, bleaching heat of the desert sun. Khalid watched its arrival on a bank of monitors, his hands resting motionless on the controls of his chair. He saw her emerge, a small, hesitant figure swallowed by the vastness of the runway. She was dressed in a simple, ill-fitting dress that had likely been bought for the occasion, her only luggage a small, worn suitcase that his men took from her with detached efficiency. She looked so breakable, a pale, fragile thing about to be consumed by the gilded cage he had built for himself. He followed her progress on the cameras as she was escorted through the cavernous, echoing halls of his palace. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched as if to make herself smaller, to disappear into the intricate patterns of the Persian rugs. She didn't gasp at the soaring ceilings, the cascading chandeliers made of Venetian crystal, or the priceless art that adorned the walls. She seemed to see none of it. Her world had shrunk to the space directly in front of her feet. He met her in the grand atrium, a vast, sun-drenched space with a fountain carved from a single block of marble at its center. He had positioned himself in the middle of the room, an immovable island of white linen and quiet authority. When she finally looked up and saw him, she froze. Her gaze flickered from his face to the intricate machinery of his wheelchair and back again. There was no revulsion in her eyes, he noted with clinical detachment, only a fresh wave of that deep, overwhelming fear. "Annalise," he said. Her name sounded different in the echoing space, heavier. She flinched as if he had struck her. "Welcome to your new home," she said nothing, only offering a tiny, jerky nod. Her throat worked, but no sound came out. Faisal stood a respectful distance away, his presence a silent testament to his loyalty. "You will be shown to your rooms," Khalid continued, his tone flat, transactional. "They are in the west wing. My own are in the east." You will not be disturbed. He was offering her a prison, but a comfortable one. He was offering her distance, a courtesy he imagined she would crave. She nodded again, her eyes fixed on the floor. He could feel the waves of her anxiety radiating across the polished marble. It was an uncomfortable, alien feeling in his sterile world. He had expected this, of course. He had planned for it. But the reality of her silent, trembling presence was more unsettling than he had anticipated. He gestured to a waiting servant, a woman in a modest black abaya. Take her, as she was led away, her small suitcase trailing behind her. She cast one last, fleeting look over her shoulder. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, he saw not just fear, but a profound, soul-deep loneliness that mirrored his own. The first week passed in a whisper. Annalise was a ghost in his palace, a silent wraith who moved through the opulent halls leaving no trace of her existence. Khalid, a man accustomed to knowing everything that happened within his walls, found himself tracking her movements with a strange, obsessive focus. He watched her on the security feeds, a lonely figure in the vast, empty library, running her fingers over the spines of books she never opened. He saw her in the sprawling gardens at dawn, her face turned towards the rising sun, her expression unreadable. She ate her meals alone in her suite, refusing the lavish spreads prepared by his personal chef, requesting only simple things: toast, soup, tea. She asked for nothing, touched nothing, wanted nothing. Her complete lack of avarice was, in itself, a curiosity. Any other woman in her position would have been exploring the closets filled with designer clothes he'd had procured, or the vault of priceless jewelry. Annalise seemed to shrink away from the wealth, as if it might burn her. She wore the same few simple dresses she had arrived with, washed by her own hand in the palatial bathroom. Her deference was absolute, but it wasn't born of respect. It was the quiet, still obedience of a trapped animal. He found himself growing irritated by her silence, by her resolute invisibility. He had purchased a wife, a presence, not a phantom. One afternoon, he wheeled himself towards the library, the quiet whir of his chair the only sound in the corridor. He found her there as he knew he would be. She was standing by a window, looking out at the endless expanse of sand, a thick leather-bound volume of poetry clutched in her hands. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him approach. "Do you enjoy Keats?" he asked, his voice startling her. She jumped, the book tumbling from her grasp and landing with a soft thud on the thick rug. A flush of crimson stained her cheeks. I'm sorry," she stammered, bending to retrieve it. "I shouldn't have. I can put it back." "I did not say you shouldn't have it," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I asked if you enjoy it." She clutched the book to her chest like a shield. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes still on the floor. He understands that beauty can also be sad." Khalid felt a strange tightening in his chest. It was the most she had said to him since her arrival. Her voice was soft, hesitant, like the rustle of dry leaves. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a contract or a component of a long-laid plan, but as the young woman standing before him, drowning in a world she never asked for. He saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the slight tremble in her hands. He had orchestrated this, brought her to this place of gilded misery. The weight of that decision settled on him, heavier than it had ever felt before. He began to seek her out, drawn by a force he refused to name. He would find her in the library and ask her about the books she chose. At first, her answers were clipped, monosyllabic, but slowly, hesitantly, she began to open up. He learned she had been studying literature before her father had pulled her from university. He learned she loved the smell of old paper and rain-soaked earth, two things that did not exist in his desert world. Her shyness was a fortress, but he found small, unguarded gates in her love for stories. One evening, he found her tracing the constellations on a star chart. "My mother used to show them to me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, not realizing he had entered the room. "She said they were stories written in light, for everyone to share, Khalid stopped his chair in the shadows, listening. She said that even when you feel lost, you can look up and know you're part of something bigger. A part of the same story. He wheeled himself into the light. And do you feel lost, Annalise? The question was direct, and she flinched, her brief moment of peace shattered. She turned to face him, her expression shuddered once more. This is a very large house, she deflected, her gaze falling. It was a non-answer, but it told him everything. He felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar, a protective instinct. He had brought her here for his own reasons that were still a closely guarded secret. But the sight of her quiet suffering was becoming a constant, low-level ache in his chest. I was in an accident, he said, the words abrupt, torn from a place of deep privacy. A car. This is why I am. Like this, she looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. No one spoke of his condition. It was the great, unspoken fact of his existence. I'm sorry, she said, and the words were not laced with the pity he so despised. They were simple, genuine, a soft, clean expression of empathy. It must have been difficult. Difficulty is relative, he said, the old, cold mask slipping back into place. But the mask felt brittle, ill-fitting. Her simple, honest sorrow had breached a defense he had thought impenetrable. He watched her for a long moment, the starlight from the window catching the auburn strands in her hair. She was not looking at his chair. She was looking at his face. For the first time, he felt as though someone was seeing him, Khalid al-Jamil, the man, not the cripple, not the billionaire. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation. He had set this all in motion to reclaim a piece of his past, but he was beginning to fear that this quiet, sad-eyed girl might completely upend his future. That night, sleep offered him no refuge. His mind was a maelstrom of present-day anxieties and ghosts from a life lived before the accident, before the billions had become a barrier as insurmountable as his paralysis. He dismissed his night attendant and wheeled himself to a reinforced vault hidden behind a panel of mahogany in his study. The code was entered with practiced, silent efficiency. Inside, amongst the deeds, the bearer bonds, and the legal documents that constituted the architecture of his empire, was a simple, locked rosewood box. He placed it on his lap and carried it to his desk. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he unlocked it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a jewel or a precious metal, but a child's drawing. It was on cheap, lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. The drawing depicted two stick figures under a lopsided, smiling sun. One figure was taller, with bright yellow crayon hair. The other was smaller, with scribbled brown hair. The smaller one was handing the taller one a flower. The artistry was clumsy, the proportions all wrong, but it was the most valuable thing Khalid owned. He picked it up, the paper impossibly fragile in his large hands. He remembered the cold. Not the sterile, artificial cold of his palace, but a biting, wet cold that had seeped into his bones. He had been 10 years old on a trip to New York with his parents. He'd gotten separated from them in a sprawling park, his childish curiosity leading him down a winding path until he was hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. Panic had set in as the sky grew dark and a chilling autumn rain began to fall. He was just a boy, alone and scared in a foreign country. He'd huddled under a large oak tree, shivering, tears freezing on his cheeks. And then she had appeared, a little girl with hair the color of autumn leaves and serious, concerned eyes. She couldn't have been more than 7. She wasn't afraid of his strange clothes or his accented, stammering English. She had simply taken off her own small red coat and draped it over his shoulders. "You're cold," she had said, her voice clear and small. She had sat with him, chattering about her school and her dog, and she had given him that drawing. "To make you feel better," she'd explained. She had been his anchor in a sea of fear until his frantic parents and their security team had finally found him. In the chaos, she had slipped away, and he never even learned her name. But he had kept the coat and the drawing. They were relics of the purest, most selfless act of kindness he had ever known. Years later, after the accident that had taken his mobility, he had commissioned the search. He wanted to find the girl with the autumn hair. The search was long, expensive, and yielded thousands of false leads. But eventually, his investigators found her, matching the park, the date, and a vague family memory of a lost red coat. Annalise Croft, the daughter of a failing businessman on the brink of total ruin. He looked at the drawing again, then at the live security feed of Annalise, asleep in her vast, lonely bed. He hadn't bought a bride. He had been trying, in his own clumsy, broken way, to find the one person in the world who had ever shown him kindness without asking for anything in return. The atmosphere in the palace began to shift, an almost imperceptible thawing of the glacial distance between them. Khalid found himself arranging his days to coincide with her quiet rhythms. He would take his morning coffee on the terrace adjoining the library, knowing she would be there. They began to speak more freely. He told her of the desert, of its harsh beauty and the clarity one could find in its endless emptiness. She, in turn, told him of her dreams of teaching, of her desire to see the world not as a tourist, but as a student of its cultures and stories. He saw the passion ignite in her eyes when she spoke of books, a fire he had thought long extinguished. She started to look at him without fear. She saw the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the subtle humor that sometimes curved his lips, the immense strength in his shoulders and arms. She began to see the man, not his circumstances. One evening, he took her to the Royal Observatory, a domed structure at the highest point of the palace grounds. Under the canopy of 1,000,000 stars, clear and bright in the unpolluted desert sky, he spoke of his father's love for astronomy. He said that a king must understand the heavens to properly rule the earth, Khalid said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He believed that everything was connected, written in the stars. My mother said that, too, Annalise whispered, her gaze fixed on the Milky Way, a brilliant sash of light across the darkness. She was standing near his chair, close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. An impulse, sudden and powerful, seized him. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the cool metal of the telescope. She gasped softly but didn't pull away. Her hand was small and warm in his. It was the first time they had touched. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that traveled up his arm and settled deep in his chest. In that moment, under the silent watch of the cosmos, the last of his cold, clinical detachment evaporated. This was no longer about repaying a debt from the past. This was about the woman beside him, the gentle soul who was slowly, painstakingly, teaching his frozen heart how to feel again. He had brought her here to save a memory, but he was beginning to realize, with a terrifying certainty, that she was the one who was saving him. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. A new story was being written, not in the stars above, but in the quiet space between two lonely souls. The fragile peace was shattered by a call from America. Khalid took it in his study, the doors firmly closed, but the grating, demanding voice of Mr. Croft was loud enough to carry. Faisal stood by the door, his expression grim. The initial payment was generous, Al-Jamil, but my circumstances have shifted. Croft's voice oozed a false cordiality that curdled in the air. A man of your stature understands that investments require upkeep. Khalid's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. The terms of our agreement were explicit and final, Mr. Croft. Your debts are cleared. That is the extent of our transaction. Ah, but you see it as a transaction. I see it as a family matter now. The man wheezed, his greed naked and shameless. My daughter, your wife. A scandal would be so unfortunate. A forced marriage, a young, innocent American girl sold to people might draw unpleasant conclusions. A monthly stipend would ensure such conclusions are never drawn. It was blackmail, clumsy and pathetic, but infuriating nonetheless. Are you threatening me? Khalid's voice was dangerously low, a blade of ice. I'm protecting my family's interests, Croft countered. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Faisal opened it a crack to see Annalise standing there, a tray with a glass of water in her hands. She had noticed he'd been locked in his study for over an hour and had grown concerned. She heard her father's voice through the phone, loud and abrasive. "Just a small sign of your appreciation for my lovely Annalise." Her face went pale. The glass trembled in her hand, and water sloshed over the side. She understood immediately. Her father wasn't done. He was still selling her piece by piece. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with horror and shame. She turned and fled down the hallway, the sound of her father's greedy voice chasing her. Khalid heard the commotion, saw the look on Faisal's face, and knew she had overheard. He ended the call with a curt, final pronouncement. "You will receive nothing more from me, Croft. And if you ever contact me or my wife again, you will discover the true meaning of the word ruin." He slammed the phone down, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not just about blackmail. It was about the defilement of Annalise's spirit by the one man who should have protected her. He had to find her. He had to make it right. He found her in the library, curled into a small ball in a large armchair, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. The sound of his wheelchair on the rug made her look up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a desperate shame. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know he would do this. I'm so ashamed." "This is not your shame, Annalise," Khalid said, his voice firm yet gentle. He maneuvered his chair to face her, closing the distance between them. "It is his. You have nothing to apologize for." "But he used me. He used you," she cried, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He sold me to you and now he wants more. You must hate me. You must regret this whole arrangement." He looked at her, at the raw pain etched onto her features, and knew the time for secrets was over. The foundation of their new, fragile connection had to be built on truth, no matter how unbelievable. "I do not regret it," he said softly. "And I could never hate you. I didn't marry you because of your father's debts, Annalise. I married you because I have been looking for you for 15 years. Her sobbing stopped, replaced by a stunned, confused silence. She stared at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his for any sign of deception. What are you talking about?" He wheeled himself to a small, ornate desk in the corner of the library and unlocked a drawer. He withdrew the worn, folded piece of notebook paper and held it out to her. Hesitantly, she took it. She unfolded the drawing of the two stick figures under the smiling sun. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand New York City," Khalid said, his voice thick with memory. 15 years ago, a cold day in a park. A lost little boy from a foreign country, crying under a tree. Annalise's eyes widened, a flicker of a long-forgotten memory stirring in her mind. "You gave him your coat," Khalid continued, his gaze intense. "And you gave him this drawing to make him feel better. You stayed with him until he was safe." She looked from the childish drawing to his face, the impossible truth dawning on her. The dark, serious eyes of the man in front of her. They were the same as the scared little boy's. "That was you?" she breathed, the words barely audible. "That was me," he confirmed. "Your father's greed was not the reason for this marriage, Annalise. It was merely the opportunity. The clumsy, desperate excuse for a man who did not know how else to find the only person who ever showed him true kindness." The revelation hung in the air between them, shimmering and immense. It recontextualized everything. The cold contract, the vast and lonely palace, his watchful, distant gaze. It wasn't a purchase. It was a rescue mission, albeit a misguided and autocratic one. Annalise sank back into the chair, the child's drawing held delicately in her hands as if it were a sacred text. A memory, hazy and dreamlike, surfaced. A small, dark-haired boy with terrified eyes, the weight of her too big red coat on his small shoulders. She had forgotten it completely, a minor childhood event buried under years of her father's emotional neglect and financial instability. To her, it had been a simple act of kindness. To him, it had been a defining moment that had echoed through his life. "All this time," she whispered, looking at him with new eyes, "you knew who I was, I knew the little girl you were, he corrected gently. I spent the last few weeks getting to know the woman you have become. And she is even more remarkable. He finally allowed the vulnerability he had kept locked away to show in his expression. My life is complicated, Annalise. This chair, this wealth, they build walls. People see what they want to see. A symbol, an account balance, a cripple. They don't see the man. But you, that day in the park you saw a cold, scared boy. And here, in this palace, I think you are beginning to see the man. Am I wrong? Tears welled in her eyes again. But this time they were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming emotion. She slowly rose from the chair and walked towards him. For the first time, she initiated the contact, kneeling on the floor beside his wheelchair so they were at eye level. She placed her hand over his on the armrest, her touch tentative but sure. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. You're not wrong. The library, which had once felt like a beautiful prison, now felt like a sanctuary. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken words, but filled with a deep and resonant understanding. They talked for hours, long into the night. He told her about the accident, about the crushing loneliness that followed, and about how the memory of her small act of kindness had become a beacon in his darkest moments. She told him about her mother's passing, about her quiet dreams, and about the slow erosion of her spirit under her father's selfish ambitions. They were two broken pieces from different worlds, but they fit together in a way neither had ever thought possible. The contract signed under duress had been dissolved, replaced by an invisible, unbreakable bond forged in a shared past and a hopeful, uncertain future. In the weeks that followed, the palace transformed. The cavernous halls, once echoing with silence and solitude, now felt filled with a quiet warmth. The change was not in the decor, but in the atmosphere. It was in the way Khalid's severe expression would soften whenever Annalise entered a room. It was in the sound of her gentle laughter, a sound he had never heard before, as he shared stories of his childhood in the desert. She was no longer a ghost haunting the West Wing. She moved her things into a room adjoining his, not out of obligation, but out of a simple, profound desire to be near him. She would read to him in the evenings, her voice a soothing balm to his restless mind. She wasn't afraid to touch him anymore, often resting her hand on his shoulder or arm as they spoke. Each touch was a small act of demolition, breaking down the walls he had spent years building around his heart. He, in turn, began to share his world with her. He taught her about his business, not the cold numbers but the vision behind it, funding sustainable technology, building schools in impoverished regions. She saw that his vast wealth was not a hoard, but a tool, one he wielded with great responsibility. She helped him draft responses to philanthropic requests, her innate empathy providing a perspective his business-oriented mind often missed. They became partners in a way that had nothing to do with their marriage certificate. Faisal watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. He saw his employer, a man he had long respected but also pitied for his profound loneliness, finally find a measure of peace. He saw the shy, terrified young woman blossom, her confidence growing under the gentle sun of Khalid's affection and respect. One afternoon, they were in the garden, a lush oasis of green in the heart of the desert. Annalise was describing the changing seasons of her home, the brilliant reds and golds of autumn. I missed that, she admitted softly. The feeling of change in the air. Khalid looked at her, her face animated, her eyes bright with nostalgia. He loved the way she saw the world, finding beauty in the smallest details. We will go there, he said simply. We will find a house in the countryside, and you can have a garden that changes with every season. Her eyes widened. Really? Annalise, he said, his voice earnest and deep. He reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Your home is with me now, but that does not mean you have to lose the world you came from. We will build a new world, our world, together in that moment, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the gentle burble of the fountains. Annalise knew she was truly home. It wasn't the palace or the wealth. It was him, The paralyzed Arab billionaire she had been forced to marry was the same scared little boy she had comforted years ago, and he had become the man who held her heart. He had chosen her all along, not as a possession, but as his destiny. And she, in turn, chose him back, freely and with all her heart.